Hello and a very warm welcome to a brand new edition of World Panorama with me, Frank Pereira, on Rajya Sabha Television. Over the next half an hour, we'll bring you a roundup of all the significant events to have happened around the world this week. But first, a look at the headlines. Terror in the heart of Europe. String of attacks in Brussels suggests the Islamic State terror group has homed in on prosperous nations of the Schengen zone. Calls for better intelligence sharing and security revamps against the challenge. European Union goes about efforts to implement its agreement with Turkey to check the migrant influx. Deportations and checks get underway, but it's an uphill task yet as the refugee influx refuses to slow. History is created as Barack Obama becomes the first sitting US president to visit Cuba since 1928, an initiative to thaw cold ties even as deep divisions persist. And United States and Russia agree to push for a political transition in Syria by having a new draft constitution ready by August. UN brokered effort to bring opposing sides to the talks table fails to yield results. Our top story this week: terror strikes in the heart of Europe. Twin blasts at the Brussels airport and one at a local train station on Tuesday killed 31 people and injured nearly 300. The attack within 4 months of the Paris carnage carries implications and question marks at a number of levels, not least of them being security and information sharing lapses that demand urgent correction under new challenges. Here's a detailed report.
The gory aftermath. Minutes before 8 a.m. on March 22nd, two explosions moments apart tore through the check-in area of Brussels' Zaventem airport. Suicide attackers who blew themselves up at opposite ends of the hall, unleashing mayhem. The spot chosen to hit the widest target, people of 40 nationalities killed or wounded. Just over an hour later, a third blast at Maelbeek metro station in the city centre, close to several EU institutions. A three-carriage train was just leaving the station, the next stop a short distance away, when the blast happened. Shock, horror, maximum alert sounded, and somewhere an acceptance that after Paris, something like this was waiting to happen.
We feared a terrorist attack would happen, and that is what happened.
These were attacks in Belgium. They could just as well be attacks in Britain or in France or Germany or elsewhere.
But it is quite clear that the roots of the pain we are suffering around our region are very much the same.
The three biggest suspects of the airport attacks, pictures from CCTV minutes before the blasts. Two of them, brothers, had blown themselves up. The third went missing. Through last week, Belgian police carried out multiple raids across the country, besides those in Germany and France. At least 9 suspects were rounded up. 2 who resisted arrest were shot at. A terror plot in the making was foiled in France. Deep links to the Paris attacks in November are apparent. A well-oiled Islamic State terror machinery operating across Europe becomes even more obvious. Amid a high alert and heavy security deployment in cities across the Schengen zone, analysts warn of more to come.
Paris attacks showed us that there was clearly a substantial network at play in Europe. So not just the 9 attackers, but the support team that drove the vehicles, that provided accommodation, sourced the weaponry, etc. That was then illustrated when Abdeslam was able to go on the run for 4 months, clearly moving between locations in Belgium, aided by this network, which has now seemingly been able to produce another attack on a lower but no less significant scale.
Interior and Justice ministers of EU nations held emergency meetings. The ease of the attacks, first Paris, then Brussels, raised urgent foundational questions on shortcomings in sharing strategic intelligence data. Despite its easy cross-border ties on banking and travel, experts say the EU still struggles with effective intelligence sharing along national and bureaucratic lines.
Every day we discover in the framework of what happened in Paris and in Brussels how important it is that our intelligence services, that our judicial services exchange all relevant information that is required.
We need a European pact, a pact of freedom and security. Terrorists aim at our freedom because they know freedom is the trademark of Europe. Europe needs to go all the way this time. We need to invest in a single defense and security structure.
Terror and the human tragedy. Again, Europe mourns its innocent dead as stories emerge of lucky escapes and tragic ill fortune of people caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Blame it on the migrant influx, on faulty global politics, on warped, distorted mindsets, and a whole lot else. Reality only says this terror monster is here to wipe out utopias, and the fight against it is a long one. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Joining me for a chat this week to talk about this is Mohan Goswami, international affairs expert. Thank you so much for joining me on the program, Mr. Guruswamy. Could this attack, these attacks in Belgium, in Brussels, could they have been avoided? And is Europe as such susceptible to such attacks because of the number of migrants that the continent really houses? It started with Madrid in 2004, then you had London 2005, Paris a couple of times, and now Brussels.
You see, given hindsight, you can always say that, attacks could have been avoided. But you never have the benefit of hindsight. And you can never avert all attacks. You can intercept some of them. The amount of intelligence you need, the amount of penetration you need, is just not feasible or possible in a free society. It's only possible in a police state, and where you have people informing on neighbors and families, children informing on parents, and what have you. It's not possible under the structure of a democratic nation. And much of Europe is like that, so it's very difficult. But there are things which could have been done better. For instance, lack of coordination is well known in Europe. First of all, there are separate police forces, and they're highly decentralized. The police in Molenbeek doesn't coordinate with the police in Brussels and Molenbeek, and all this is there. So you have that structure also, which makes it very difficult. And there's also some degree of incompetence involved. After all, this man, the most wanted man in the world, Abdul Salam, escaped from Paris after conducting the attacks.
Yes.
And went off, sent for a car from Brussels. Car comes and picks him up. He goes through 3 checkposts, ends up in Brussels, and then disappears. And how many, and it stays a few blocks from his home. And they only got him accidentally, because when the body of one of the terrorists who died in Paris was being buried after being released after many months by the police, the police noticed about 20 people, and they put a tail on them, and they were monitoring their mobile phones. And in that, this man's name came up again. And that's how they got him.
Yes.
So obviously there's a huge degree of incompetence involved here, and it's also the structure, the lack of a centralized SAR. In America you got Homeland Security.
Yes.
Everything is looking at. Europe is difficult. Europe is a fragmented country. The Union itself is frayed at the edges. The financial crisis, where countries don't respect each other's wishes, is all been there, and Europe is coming to an end. And to blame it on the refugees is also not correct, because all the terrorists, whether it's in Britain or whether it's in France or whether it's in Spain or Brussels, are second or third generation migrants.
And most of them complain that the kind of living conditions they're going through in their new homes are not very great, and it's because of that, because of the lack of jobs and because of several of the other issues that they tend to get drawn towards an Islamic State, for instance.
Yeah, there is ghettoization in Europe. There's no doubt about it. Europe is also a highly racist society. They're not overtly racist, but covertly and culturally they're very racist people, and so there is ghettoization. You see it in France, you see it in Belgium, you see it everywhere, in Germany. But opportunities, France, Belgium, even Britain, Spain, are going through huge economic slowdowns. Germany is prospering. Germany is the only one in Europe, which is growing. So you don't have this kind of terrorism. The people have jobs, well-paid jobs, and there also a degree of tolerance in Germany, which is not visible in other countries. Germans accept. They don't give you citizenship if you're foreign born.
Yes.
But they treat you as one. They call you Gastarbeiter, a guest worker, and then you know your place.
Indeed.
Whereas in France and Britain and all this big show of you being one of us, and therefore become like one of us. It's not feasible. We operate at different levels. We have a formal nationality, and then we have a real nationality. I could be an Indian and still be a British citizen. All the Indians who flocked in Wembley to meet our Prime Minister, most of them are British citizens.
Indeed. But do you see an end in sight? Is there an end?
I don't see an end. I think this is just the beginning. And you'll see...
It's only going to get worse.
I don't think it's going to get worse. It may not get worse. God wishes it does not get worse. But this is going to go on for a while. Because, these populations are old populations, old communities, been there for 70, 80 years more. And, got deep roots. They don't have roots in their home country. And they have roots in their adopted countries. And so it will be very difficult for it to go just like that. The reasons for this alienation have to be better understood. After all, the first generation Arabs who are being driven out of their homes haven't taken to terrorism. Like after 450 Belgian youth joined this ISIS.
Yes.
1,100 French youth joined ISIS. So, there is something bigger driving them. So I think these societies have to look inwards also, examine themselves to see how they treat other communities within them. And I think there are serious issues with France and the rise of right-wing nationalist groups. All this have to be contained and looked at holistically.
Indeed, a holistic approach is what is required at this point in time. Thank you so much, Mohan Goswami, for joining us on the program and putting things into perspective for us. Well, on that note, we'll slip into a short break now, but still to come. Syrian troops enter Palmyra town in Syria nearly a year after Islamic State took it over and damaged priceless ancient architectural heritage. There's that and much more on the other side. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Rajya Sabha Television. Well, staying with Europe now, it's 1 week since the European Union and Turkey reached a landmark deal touted as a desperate effort to stem the raging migrant influx from Syria. There's a realization in Europe that its future depends on this accord. Though, on one hand, work is underway on registering of migrants in Turkey and deportation of illegal ones from Greece, the process remains plagued by loopholes and shortcomings. Here's more.
It's been a multi-pronged crackdown right from the day the EU and Turkey signed what they call a path-breaking deal. In Greece, migrants from Pakistan and Bangladesh rounded up and deported back to Turkey. 150 of them went in the first batch. More are being moved out. From all the Greek islands, they are ferried back to Elefsina port near Athens, where asylum applications would be processed. And along the Turkish coastline, nearly 200 migrants and refugees have been caught offshore and brought to registration centres. Their plans of reaching Europe dashed. The EU Migration Commissioner said the agreement was off to a difficult start, admitting there were the expected initial pains.
As you know, it has begun already with quite a few difficulties, as every new start has its own sensitive and difficult side. Flows cannot be reduced overnight. The arrangement has been put in force and all parties have taken up their own responsibilities. It will be judged in action. I want to believe that there won't be any problem and the cooperation will be enhanced.
Under the EU-Turkey deal, all migrants and refugees, including Syrians who cross to Greece illegally by sea, will be sent back to Turkey once they are registered and their asylum claims have been processed. For every Syrian migrant sent back to Turkey, one Syrian already in Turkey will be resettled in the EU. In addition, the EU has proposed to resettle 54,000 refugees from Syria. But the challenge is huge yet. Largely unaffected, unchecked by any treaty or crackdown, the asylum seekers continue to pour in. Men, women and children, some 1,600 of them have reached Greece's Lesbos island since the deal was struck. Officials struggle to switch from the old system to the new one while awaiting promised EU reinforcements. And the refugees, having made a dangerous journey after the nightmare at home, refuse anything other than the proverbial promised land.
My wife and my son in Germany. Okay, I want to go Germany.
I work very hard work in Turkey. I collect the money I coming here. After that, 5 minutes, I come here, 5 days, I go back to Turkey. It's very dangerous.
And that's besides the thousands already stuck here eager to move forward. The tense and squalid conditions at Idomeni have been home to nearly 12,000 people for weeks now, people desperate to get into Macedonia and ahead. Nearly 47,000 men, women and children are refugees in Greece, scattered across its islands. For them, deals and crackdowns have little meaning.
Our situation here is very bad. Our children are always hungry. There is chaos, not enough clothes. We are exhausted. We are tired of our life here. My husband is in Germany. I crossed the sea trying to get to him. We were so scared of the sea. We got here and now we are even more afraid. They are giving us no solutions. Every day we hear about different decisions. We want a solution that works for us.
Scenes like this one are almost part of daily routine in the last few days. Protests, placards and slogans with riot police standing by. Refugees of the Idomeni camp demanding they be allowed through. Images like this one, the sheer scale of the continuing migrant influx, remains the biggest challenge to the accord actually finding its feet. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha Television.
Meanwhile, the United States and Russia agreed this week to push for a political transition in Syria by having a new draft constitution ready by August. The talks in Moscow revealed a softer, more cooperative tone on Syria. Both sides agreed to use their influence to push the Syrian government to engage in direct talks with the opposition. Discussions between US Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian President Vladimir Putin lasted over 4 hours. Both sides reiterated that differences would not prevent them from cooperating on an equal footing on the problems on which they have found common ground.
The serious approach that we have been able to cooperate on has made a difference to the life of people in Syria and to the possibilities of making progress on peace. The people of Syria and the people of the region, as a result, have literally been able to taste and smell the possibilities of what it means to have a huge reduction in violence and to receive humanitarian assistance.
Meanwhile, the UN brokered effort in Geneva to bring the Syrian government and opposition coalition to the talks table ended with little headway. The UN envoy released a statement of 12 guiding principles at the end of 2 weeks of discussions with both sides, though it has no mention of political transition. The opposition left with a warning that there is no hope of progress unless Russia exerts its influence on Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. There are worries that the ceasefire in Syria will collapse if the next round of talks targeted for the 19th of April do not move quickly on the issue of political transition. In other news now, US President Barack Obama set off hopes this week of a reset in historically tension-filled US-Cuba ties, becoming the first US president to visit the island nation in 88 years. Deep-rooted mistrust between the two neighbors goes back to the Cold War, and Obama's anti-isolation outreach is still to find complete acceptance back home. Here's more.
The time is right, Obama had said as he began his trip. a sitting US president on Cuban soil. The last time that happened was 1928. After Calvin Coolidge then, it was Barack Obama this week.
I have come here to bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas. I have come here to extend the hand of friendship to the Cuban people.
Perhaps the most closely scrutinized moments of the three-day visit, the meeting between Obama and Castro. A joint inspection of the Guard, national anthems played together, warmth at a one-on-one discussion would be unthinkable in a country where resistance to the US has been part of the national mission for decades. But beyond the fanfare of the visit, there are still several important issues holding the countries back from re-establishing full ties. Obama spelled them out too.
But we cannot and should not ignore the very real differences that we have about how we organize our governments, our economies, and our societies. Cuba has a one-party system. The United States is a multi-party democracy. Cuba has a socialist economic model. The United States is an open market. Cuba has emphasized the role and rights of the state. The United States is founded upon the rights of the individual.
In his paying tributes to Cuban revolutionists Jose Marti and Che Guevara, Obama sent out a message that reverberated in Cuba and beyond. Even as he championed Cuba's private sector and expressed support for reforms. Cuba's Raul Castro has orchestrated some economic and social reforms himself, though he holds back on changing the country's single-party system or easing media restrictions. And the persistently difficult nature of the relationship comes into sharp focus. US sanctions imposed in 1960 in reaction to confiscation of American assets persist. The US has frequently expressed unhappiness at Cuba's human rights record and jailing of political dissidents. There is still no agreement on the Guantanamo Bay US naval base in Cuba, where the US built a detention center. On the international relations front, Cuba criticizes US opposition to its close ally, Venezuela's socialist government.
The blockade is the most important obstacle for our economic development and the well-being of Cuban people. That is why removing it is essential for us to normalize bilateral relations. It will also be beneficial for Cuban migrants who want the best for their families and their countries. Are advancing towards normalization, it will also be necessary that the illegally occupied territory, the Guantanamo naval base, is returned.
Within the US, if some are hopeful, many among the Cuban community in the US staged protest, angry at what they said was an American president mollycoddling an inhuman, undemocratic Cuba. The US speaker even said Obama's trip legitimized a tyrannical dictatorship. A silver lining to the relationship arises perhaps from a national poll that says the numbers of such opposers is shrinking. From that alone, Obama will hope the next US president carries forward his initiatives. Bureau Report for Rajya Sabha Television.
Well, let's now take a look at some news-making events that made headlines around the world this week in Globe Watch.
Both Republican Donald Trump and Democrat Hillary Clinton won the winner-takes-all state of Arizona Tuesday, banking more delegates to their leads over rival party candidates. Democratic challenger Bernie Sanders won caucuses in Utah and Idaho, and Republican Ted Cruz claimed his party's caucuses in Utah. Overall, Trump now has 739 delegates, still way ahead of Cruz with 465. It takes 1,237 delegates to win the GOP nomination. Clinton takes her tally to 927 in the race for 1,681 delegates. Syrian government forces entered the ancient town of Palmyra that was seized by Islamic State militants last year. State media showed warplanes flying overhead, helicopters firing missiles, and soldiers in armored vehicles approaching Palmyra. Officials had launched an offensive to retake the city earlier this month, backed by Russian airstrikes. Soon after seizing the ancient ruins in May, Islamic State militants had destroyed two 2,000-year-old temples, among other ancient architectural treasures. North Korea claims to have successfully conducted a high-powered, solid-fuel rocket engine test, which, if confirmed, would be a major step forward in boosting its missile attack capability against South Korea and the United States. North Korea uses liquid propellants for its main ballistic missiles that target South Korea, US bases in the Asia-Pacific region, and the American mainland. In recent weeks, North Korea has launched missiles and other weapons into the sea and escalated threats of attacks in response to the ongoing annual South Korea-US military drills that it views as an invasion rehearsal.
And finally, here's more to Vietnam's culture of exercise to keep the body fit and happy. Vegetable vendors in Hanoi City have taken dancing in the market aisles to beat financial and health worries. I'll leave you with these visuals. See you again next time.